And Andrew, you were on the ground in Gaza. What did you see?
Absolute devastation. Let's not pretend that Rafah isn't destroyed. I don't think there's any sense in trying to whitewash what's happened in Gaza in the sense of everything being destroyed. But the important thing is why. Okay, and if we look at how, I spoke earlier about adaptation. In Gaza City, when the IDF was assaulting through, they would clear house to house, just as we would, going through an urban environment. There was a 4-month pause put in before Rafah. Over that 4 months, you might remember All Eyes on Rafah as a campaign.
Yes, yep.
Yeah, huge international pressure. Actually, most of the evacuation from Rafah was done by Hamas. They moved people out so that they could then booby-trap all the houses. They'd seen what the IDF were doing in Gaza City. They knew they were fighting house to house. And so they decided that if the IDF was going house to house, each house would have an IED. And I think it's a lot more advanced than people realise. We're kind of used to the idea of IEDs being these kind of pressure plates in the ground like we saw in Afghanistan or Iraq. In Gaza, they are in the tunnel shafts that go into houses, 57,000 tunnel shafts in Gaza that lead to the tunnels that are 500 kilometres long. They are everywhere. So the tunnel shaft will have an IED. There'll be a camera wired into the tunnels so they can watch for the IDF entering. And then they'll be able to remotely detonate the IED when they see soldiers in the house. So at the start of the Rafah campaign, the IDF had quite bad casualties from this, to the point where they had to completely change their tactics, where they now send a drone into the building first. If there's nothing found by the drone, they send in a dog. And then only then do they send in troops, but even then only in 4-man teams rather than platoons or sections, to try and minimise the casualties if anything does go bang. Now, if that's every other house in Rafah, that's not a workable option. So as soon as you find the IED, you can't go firm and just call for the explosive ordnance disposal like we used to in Afghanistan. That would take hours. You'd never get anywhere. And so they've quite legitimately just levelled the buildings that are IED'd. Now, that has caused incredibly large amounts of destruction.
But then if that IED blows up, it's going to level the building just the same,
exactly.
right? So
Exactly.
I see your point about that. So you see this devastation, and you've commented a number of times that the British Army would do things differently. This is one of the reasons that, on reflection, Francis and I had a conversation about this on camera the other day, where we talked about why, on balance, while we're not happy about what's happening in Gaza, even remotely, I think it's horrible. I understand why Israel is doing what it's doing, because I imagine we would do the same thing in their place, if not worse. I mean, look at the response to 9/11. Right, yeah. Is the argument.
Yeah.
But what you've said is we would do things differently. So can you talk about that? The first part, how would the Western world respond to October the 7th happening to us? And secondly, how should we respond, and what is Israel doing wrong?
Well, I think when I say we would respond differently, I think that was specifically talking about the tactics at the aid sites.
Yeah.
I think we would. So the Israelis don't necessarily have a great deal of logistic experience. Okay, so when we deploy a division into the field, it will have an enormous logistical tail behind it. And the reason we're very good at that is because we do expeditionary wars. Our wars are on the other side of the world. They're in the Falklands, they're in Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. But they're certainly not, since 1945, anywhere near the UK. So you have to be very good at maintaining long logistical tails. The IDF is set up effectively for raiding, for very, very short wars on their immediate borders. You can see Israel from the far side of Gaza if you're on the right spot. That's how close it is. So they don't need to be experts at logistics, and perhaps the way that we are. And I think we would have perhaps used our military a lot more effectively than them to deliver the aid, because the RLC for us, for example, the Royal Logistic Corps, they're very, very good at that. The Israelis don't really have an equivalent, and they've struggled logistically. Even just fighting in Gaza, the duration of the war has given them logistic resupply issues right on their own border. So I think that's what we would do differently. That would be a wholly military secured site. The aid would be delivered by military troops, and we wouldn't be using contractors to do this if it was the British Army, I suspect. But then again, the Israelis haven't got this capability. Growing it from scratch is very, very difficult. So
they haven't been invading the rest of the world for several hundred years.
They haven't been blundering around the planet making fools of themselves.
Well, I don't know. The British Empire was very successful for quite some time at actually fighting the wars, and then the Americans kicked off. Anyway, but talk to us about the broader picture, because this is a fundamental question for me when I think about this issue. A lot of people think that they're being compassionate when they say that they really care about what's happening and it should be stopped and whatever. But I'm thinking, if we were the victims of an attack like October the 7th, how would we have reacted? How would the very same people who are saying, you know, oh, I can't believe what Israel's doing, what would they be demanding that we do to the people who did that to us?
So right? the counter argument to this is that some kind of decapitation campaign in the way that we saw in Lebanon, for example, where the absolutely saturated by intelligence and they were able to pick off all the leaders of Hezbollah, precision from the air. That option doesn't exist in Gaza because of the tunnels. All the leaders are underground. They have a deliberate human shield strategy. There's one really irritating piece of commentary, which is, oh, every guerrilla force does that. And actually, no, they don't. Not in the way that Hamas have done this. This is unprecedented. You know, yes, we saw tunnels in Raqqa and we saw tunnels fighting ISIS, and there are tunnels in you know, all the way back in history to digging under the walls of forts and that sort of thing. But nobody in history has ever said, look, kill my civilians. I want you to kill my civilians so that I can make PR gains out of it. And Hamas's leaders have said that explicitly. Like, it's psychotic. We're seeing families being wiped out in Gaza at the moment because Hamas fighters are gathering their families around them and waiting to die because they know that they'll get PR gains, they know they'll go to heaven together, and they know it'll make the Israelis look bad. It's psychotic, and it's a paradigm that I think we really struggle to get our heads around in the West, because that's so alien. Like, if you knew you were being hunted, the last thing you would do is gather your wife and children around you. You know, that's how warped these people's mentality is, and they want people to die, and they want their civilians to die. And so that makes it a very different campaign to any that's ever been fought before.
But the other thing seems to me, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, haven't Israel taken out all the leaders of Hamas already, and they just have new ones and they just keep going anyway? Yeah,
most of them. And that's one of the reasons I think Israel should have ceased fire 6 months ago or so. You know,
you think Israel should have stopped fighting?
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly after Sinwar died, I think there was a really good case to make and declare unilateral victory, and then negotiate, negotiate for the hostages on their own terms, rather than this stupid back and forth that we've got going at the moment.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. You say declare unilateral victory, but I guess, and look, you obviously know far more than me. How can you declare unilateral victory if the enemy doesn't want to surrender? Surely you can only declare victory when the enemy surrenders.
Well, I think victory and defeat are kind of unhelpful. I think this is a sort of a slightly out-of-date paradigm. I think what we have to talk about is in terms of succeeding or not succeeding in your strategic goals. And Israel had three: defend Israel's borders and prevent 7th of October ever happening again, defeat or dismantle, more accurately in Hebrew, Hamas, and to return the hostages. And I think if you can gauge the percentage to which you have achieved those goals, you can decide whether you need to keep going or not. And I think we can say for pretty fair certainty that Israel's border is now secure. Looking at Hamas's strategic capabilities to push force beyond the borders of Gaza, that's completely done. Hamas, most of their leadership, as you correctly say, is dead. Central Camps Battalion still exists, but they're dealing with that as we speak. The guys who planned and who kind of were the masterminds of 7th of October are all dead. Dave's dead, Haniya's dead, Sinwar is dead, Sinwar's brother's dead. You know, there is a pretty good command and control, senior leader destruction rate. And most of the hostages are home, and I don't think military force is going to get them home. So you need to find another way to bring the hostages home if that is your key concern. So I think if we look at the campaign, you know, even as most recently as January, and say, look, in terms of achieving your strategic goals, you're about there. And now on the flip side of that, you are getting hammered on the international stage. So whilst you're having tactical successes in Gaza, strategically, you're being very short-sighted because the world is turning horribly against you. Younger generations particularly are susceptible to these narratives of you being murderous, bloody, genocidal monsters. They're going to be the leaders in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And they're going to hate you. And Israel is not thinking long-term here because they're assuming that America will have their back forever and so they can do what they want, which I think is a very dangerous position.